So we're going to go over the growth and maturation side of things. So this is called peak height velocity. So when we refer to PHV, we mean peak height velocity. And quite a popular topic in football academies. We really need to be aware of this and the impact that peak height velocity will have on youth performers. So basically, the point at which the children will, or teenagers, will experience the most growth. So it's almost like when they hit puberty, coincides with puberty. So it's the accelerated growth, and it typically occurs with boys at the age of 14, roughly, and with girls at the age of 12. That's kind of an average. And that's what I expect to see. You can see here the age at the bottom, and then you will see that growth occurring now. So girls on the left, boys on the right there. However, this process differs from everyone. Okay, so you might have some early maturers. So these guys over here, and they might mature when they're 10. The average along here, and then what we call the late maturers along the other side. Now, why is it important for us to understand peak height velocity, so what it is, and the things that we need to consider when that happens, and then when it occurs? Because we have a natural selection bias. So typically, the kids that are early maturers will get selected more. So they'll play more sport because they're more physical, and the kids that are late maturers perhaps won't quite make the cut. And we know that, take Kevin De Bruyne for example, and I think the Belgium FA actually published this. He wasn't the best player at 14, he didn't particularly stand out, and he was a late maturer, so he didn't mature until later on. What tends to happen is, the kids that are early maturers, they tend to play to their strengths, so they'll end up using their physical attributes, and they'll just use that because they're getting success. What that means is that they don't actually then develop the other attributes to become a complete player. So, in a way, it can be a bit of an issue for those guys if we as coaches are not aware of it, and if we don't put strategies in place to develop them players in other areas. Equally, the late maturers, those guys probably sometimes in the academy settings will just be out of the system, and the ones that do survive typically tend to make it, because by the time that their growth spurt occurs and it all levels out, they're much better players because they had to use other attributes. And what we tend to see the most is those people in the middle. So I guess as a club, what I'd be thinking would be, okay, how do we get around those issues? First of all, are we aware of what's going on? And I'm going to go into some growth-related injuries in a minute. And then also, what are the things that can be put in place? One of the hot topics in the last few years is called biobanding. It's basically getting players who are of a similar biological age to play together, not to compete together, but like to train together and have some matches together at several points in the season. And it gives them a chance to kind of work on those skills a little bit more. So for example, if you're an early maturer, let's say you're 12 but you look like a 15-year-old, then you might go with those guys for a couple of games, and you have to manage your way around it, and vice versa. And you might do some of that, and you might chuck some of that in there to develop those skills. So that's something that's going on. Again, we're not saying compete in a league like that, it's just several things that you can do there. But again, this is from studies. You can see the process: early maturers, average, and then late maturers there, with some of those guys. Why is this important? Well, let's talk about PHV, the peak height velocity, and then let's also consider peak weight velocity. So what tends to happen is, I'll hit a growth spurt, I'll fill up, and then 6 months later, 6 to 9 months, they then tend to get what we call peak weight velocity. So they then tend to fill out a little bit more. So then you get a rapid increase in height, and then later on you get a rapid increase in weight. And so what tends to happen is, if we're not aware of these things, we can quite easily mistake this for kids are not playing very well, that all of a sudden they've stopped performing, and their performance has dropped. Well, if we're aware that they're going through this stage, we know that actually what's happening is they don't know how to manage their mass around the pitch. They've got a new body and they just don't know. And we need to modify, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in a minute as to why we can modify some of our training strategies. So, pre-PHV, circa PHV, post-PHV. So what happens before you go through that growth spurt, when you're going through it, and then afterwards, and then in adulthood. And these are some of the injuries. I go into basically this next bit covers what was in the previous slide. So the key points are injury burden is lower in football players at pre-PHV. So before they go through that growth spurt, yes, they might pick up a couple of injuries, but they're back straight away. Growth-related injuries are more burdensome circa PHV. So those growth-related injuries, if they pick them up when they're going through that growth spurt, that can become quite problematic. Muscle and ligament injuries are more burdensome post-PHV, and especially in adults. So in adult football, we then tend to see more muscle and ligament injuries, not so much those growth-related ones. And before PHV, growth-related injuries and knee joint injuries have lower burden in late maturers than those who mature on time. And then adult late maturers are at a higher risk of injury than early maturers as well. So again, we're gonna send all the slides across for you to have a look. But this is important for us to consider in terms of identifying what players could be at higher risk and what players perhaps are not, or at what phases and who's going through it. So don't tend to do it so much at the moment, but when I worked at Norwich School, we had a really good program where we identified growth and maturation, and we used to have in the office those talented athletes in the scholarship program. The ones that were going through that peak velocity, they'd be on the board, and then PE teachers, sports coaches, they would all know, and they'd be aware that those guys are going through it. So some of those injuries, we've got Sever's disease, which is inflammation across the ankles, essentially. Osteoarthritis disease, which is knees. I can never say that word very well. Epiphysitis, inflammation of growth plates, so it's like little leaguer's elbow. And then Sonen Larsen Johnson syndrome, which is a knee condition as well. And all of these are kind of overuse injuries that happen as a result of growth and maturation, or can be accelerated through growth and maturation. Okay, so it tends to happen distal to proximal. So as kids grow, you'll see those issues start to happen through the ankle first, then the knee, and then the hip. So you see under 11s, so we can kind of see it there, but under 11s, higher incidence of Sever's disease. But saying it's a bit problematic when we call it under 11s. It's the guys that are just starting to go through that growth spurt. If you've got an early maturer in there, then that might be a little bit earlier in the process, or later if they're late maturers. But when they go through that growth spurt, typically ankle, then under 13s, more knee, osteoarthritis, and then elevated risk of injury for players going through that growth spurt as well. So what I tend to say is keep an eye, if they need new football boots and they're around about that age, probably an indication that they could be starting that period of growth. If they complain about knee issues and they're going through that, it might be. Now, my suggestion is, if they're complaining about that, see a physio. But always see a physio if you're concerned. But I think it's important for us to have a general understanding of what's going on there. So we also need to consider the injuries that happen at senior level. So most common muscular injury is hamstring. So senior, 0.8 for incidence, under 19s, under 16s, under 14s, so on. So it becomes more and more present as they get older, these types of injuries. They occur usually when sprinting, cutting, accelerating, etc. Higher occurrence of these injuries during the later stages of the second half. Most incidents reported in August, when they come back from a layoff period essentially. And higher occurrences in wide players, fullbacks, and forwards. So essentially anyone that's going to make a sprint of a longer distance is at higher risk, and usually faster players as well. So we're talking about youth athletes. Why is this important? Well, we also need to prepare them for some of the things that may be occurring later down the line. Okay, if they've never done any type of strength conditioning before, suddenly they reach adulthood, well, we'd have to teach them how to lift from scratch, we'd have to teach them how to move from scratch. It's then a lot harder. We need to start implementing these things a little bit earlier so that we can start to prevent those things from happening. Okay, so this is just what I was talking about in a different graph. So you've got pre-traversal, circuit, and post. I'll just talk you through that a little bit in terms of what's going on. So you've got heightened movement variability here, and the training is more neurally driven. Okay, so anything that you do training-wise is gonna elicit neuromuscular adaptations. So like things like neuromuscular coordination, they will get stronger, but it's all to do with the nervous system, not muscles, etc. They're not all of a sudden gonna have massive biceps. When they go through PhD, you encounter something called adolescent awkwardness. Not always, but sometimes. And that's when they like damn you on ice. All of a sudden, if those of you that potentially coach those age groups, you'll see a lot of those athletes. They now don't really know how to manage their body mass as effectively. So what we need to be doing in that phase, again, heightened risk of injury, it's more complex than this, but if I'm going to give you some applicable interventions, is watch their training load. So how much they're doing throughout the week. So those guys, if they're complaining about knee issues and you feel like they're going through that spurt, reduce their training volume. They shouldn't be playing football every day of the week and then doing PE and then playing at lunchtime, etc. So it's about educating the players. Typically what we like to say is if they're going through that and they're complaining, getting the athletes to actually manage their own training. So we tend to say if the pain goes above a 3 out of 10 or goes to a 3 out of 10, then you need to stop playing. So
Would that be just for like high intensity training? Or would you
good question. Good question.
Still be low intensity walking or whatever?
Good. Yeah. So it's going to be, we say generally all training, but I'll go into a little bit more depth. It's more movements that require high eccentric loading. What I mean by that is any type of deacceleration. So if you're jumping and you're landing, if you're having to sprint and then stop quickly, so small sided gains, things like that. Definitely not indoor because of the impact. So the strategies that I would put in place is if you've got those guys, still keep them involved, but can you maybe, if you're playing like a game where you're working on your transitions, from side to side, for example, maybe put them at the end so they don't have to, or get them to play make a little bit more so there's not as many cutting movements, but still keep them involved. And then the other way, if you want to go into more depth, this probably works better as a parent because as coaches, often they have the luxury of doing this, is RPE times the duration in minutes. So RPE is the rate of perceived exertion. So how hard do they find the session on a scale of 1 to 10? And you take that number and you times it by how long they played in minutes, and that will give you a number. And then you add that all up at the end of the week, and that gives you a general training volume for that week. And you try and reduce that training volume a little bit, and you can then keep an eye on that. So that's an easy way. That's how they tend to do it in terms of research. But you can't do that for every kid. There's no chance. And then once they've gone through PHV, then they're going to be able to handle their mass. The resistance training is then going to be more morphological. So because they're going to get an increase in testosterone, both males and females, then they will put on a little bit of muscle mass, but it's important to note that females will put on more fat mass. And this is where we start to see a lot of females start to drop out of sport, unfortunately. So I work with a lot of swimmers, and this, psychologically, this is going to be very important for them when they go through this stage, because in swimming, it's a little bit more obvious because they've got a time that they need to hit, and all of a sudden, when they're 14, they're not swimming as well as when they were 10. So what's going on? Well, they've developed, they now got more, essentially more fat mass, and that's going to slow them down, and they're going to need to manage that. So psychologically, that can be quite difficult to manage, but again, strength and conditioning program will help reduce some of those side effects, essentially. And then also, talking about the osteoslatters, severs, etc., in football clubs, in academies where they have the luxury of taking kids into strength and conditioning, what they tend to do, not always, but there's quite a few that tend to do this, is they reduce their time on the pitch and they put them in the gym and do a little bit more strength training. Because what the strength training will do is it will help the athletes tolerate those loads. And so for me, the strength and conditioning early on is going to be about teaching those fundamental movement skills so that they can move well, so that they don't get hurt when they're on the pitch. But then there's a famous saying, which is the best ability we can give an athlete is availability. So strength conditioning, the main purpose is to improve performance, reduce the risk of injury, and when we reduce the risk of injury, they can play more. And I like to use a stick analogy. Take 2 sticks, a weak one and a stronger one, and you hit them with the exact same force. Weaker one will break, stronger one won't. So what we're trying to do is make them more robust so that they can tolerate higher training loads. So if they start early, you know that number we said we could calculate, so how difficult it is by the duration. If they're stronger, they're going to be able to play more. If they're able to play more without getting hurt, without accumulating as much fatigue, they're going to get better. Because essentially, again, tolerating more training than other kids. So what can we actually do? So the non-modifiable things we can't really control are previous injuries. So if we've got previous injuries, not much we can really do about that. And the rapid growth. Partially modifiable, fatigue, and early specialisation. So that's another thing I didn't touch on. Early specialisation. Kids need to be playing lots of sports, especially early on. They shouldn't really be specialising until, it's hard to put, it's different for everyone, but I'm probably going to go around 13, 14. They need to be developing lots of different fundamental movement skills. And then that's another problem for us to solve, because how you then manage volume is a bit of a problem. Or, and this is a personal belief, instead, you could get them into strength conditioning. And I'm going to take the swimming example. My swimmers, they spend a lot of time in the pool. In strength and conditioning, a lot of times people think I'm going to try and make them swim better. Actually, I'm going to try and give them what they're not getting from the sport, so that they remain injury-free and they're still healthy, especially when they go into adulthood and they're not in pain.